In this video, we're looking at the Womier G75, a coffee-themed transparent keyboard that's very much centered around the RGB, but has a few other little tricks up its sleeve as well. Thanks to XVX for sending this one over for a review. Affiliate links and discount codes will be provided in the description. So the Womier G75 sits in the same category as keyboards like the Cool Killer CK75, the Gamma K GK75, and the Mel Geek Mojo 84. What makes you look twice at the Womier G75 is the price. With the tri-mode fully assembled version coming in at just $100, it's $60 cheaper than the Cool Killer, $70 cheaper than the Gamma K, and $120 cheaper than the Mel Geek. It has some fairly standard features like the 75% layout with a knob, a south-facing Hotswap PCB with full perky RGB and an RGB side light, and it's compatible with both Windows and Mac. But in addition to being cheaper than the previously mentioned keyboards, as I say, this keyboard has a few tricks up its sleeve, which I like. First is the availability of 4 different options to suit your needs and budget. The wired kit is $63, the tri-mode kit is $70, the wired keyboard is $76, and the tri-mode keyboard is $100. Second is that you get 2 mounting options, which you don't often see in keyboards at this price point. You can keep it gasket mounted as it comes stock, or you can change to top mount. Third is that the keyboard comes with screw-in stabilizers, which is great at this price point. And fourth is that the switches come pre-lubed, and it's a decent enough lube job that I wouldn't bother hand lubing the switches. So let's unbox this thing and see if it lives up to the impressive specification and pricing. In the box you get the fully assembled keyboard, 3 plain keycaps to replace the accents, some spare silicone gaskets, the silicone socks for top mounting, a cleaning brush, a switch and keycap puller, an Allen key for disassembly, the top mount screws, some spare case screws, a cable, and the manual. Now let's get the stock typing test done so we can get into first impressions. This is in the gasket mount configuration. With the exception of some rattly stabilizer action, that was a pretty nice typing test. Silicone gaskets on a polycarbonate plate will almost always make for a soft typing feel, and transparent plastics usually give this nice and poppy sound profile. While giving the keyboard a first proper inspection, I can see there are some quality control issues going on here, first being that around a third of the keycaps weren't fully seated on the switches. No big deal, but it was very obvious when looking down at the keyboard, which is cause for concern regarding quality control during assembly. Unfortunately, this turned out to be a fair assumption when I realised that the encoder knob was nowhere near centered in the cutout in the case, and with a downward angle instead of being at a right angle to the PCB. This looks horrible, and the encoder knob is actually rubbing on the case during use because of it. Looking in from the side, I can see that the nearest gasket isn't sitting correctly, so maybe it's just caught up on something which is pushing the encoder knob out of alignment. We'll check this when I have it apart shortly. The keycaps are nice for this keyboard if you're looking to make the most of the RGB and like the look of them. They are doubleshot PBT, and the white has a nice texture for typing. You can see the Womier coffee switches nicely match the rest of the keyboard, and they have a reasonable lube job using an oil of some kind. It's a good enough lube job though, as the switches are smooth and there's no spring ping. Next, let's get it apart. We just need to remove the 10 case screws from underneath, and this is when I noticed the difference in the countersinking of the front and back screws. They've opted to use the same length screws and countersunk them deeper to account for the thicker case profile at the back. I don't like this at all in terms of the look, as the front case screws are much closer to the surface of the case and clearly visible, while the back screws are countersunk much deeper and out of sight. With the screws out, we can lift off the top case and set that aside. Then we carefully tilt up the plate and PCB, unplug the daughterboard wire from the PCB and lift it out. And that's as far as I'm going to disassemble this one, as I'm just going to syringe lube the stabilizers and we'll leave all the dampening in place. You can see here that the silicone gaskets are nice and thick and consistently spaced on all 4 edges of the plate. The plate mount stabilizers look like the Durock V2 imitations you often see in stock keyboards. They will be fine, but could probably do with removing for balancing if you experience persistent rattle. We have a switch mat on the PCB which will give a deeper and creamier sound. We have plate foam dampening dampening between the plate and PCB to reduce hollowness. When we flip it over, we can also see there is a dampening pad stuck to the bottom of the PCB, which will both occupy space in the case to reduce hollowness and will act as kind of a tape mod. In the bottom of the case, we have the silicone dampening filling out the rest of the case. All of the dampening is fine where it is for me, as dampening is usually a good thing in plastic chassis keyboards. In the bottom case, we have the daughter board, which allows for the movement of the gasket, and generally speaking, the quality of everything looks good. Next, I just wanted to confirm that the encoder was just off center because the gasket didn't land properly. I just held the plate and PCB in the bottom case and inspected the gasket, and it looked fine, so I didn't think much more of it. Before top mounting, I did a quick lube job on the stabilizer stems without removing them using Krytox 205 grade 0, then I syringe lube to get rid of the rattle. This seemed to do the trick and saved me disassembling the plate and PCB. Changing the configuration to top mount is easy. It looks like you can just leave the gaskets on, which I did, as it will look better through the case. You just install the silicone socks on the plate, then fasten the plate and PCB to the top case using the screws with the wide heads. Next, you just plug the daughter board back into the PCB and land the top case on the bottom case. Use the same 10 screws to secure the case, and that's the keyboard back together in the top mount configuration. Once I flipped it back over and installed the encoder knob, I could see we still had the same problem with it being off center and the nearest gasket not looking like it was seated properly. I took the case back apart and removed some top mount screws to see what was going on, which is when I noticed the absolutely shocking installation of the encoder on the PCB. It's nowhere near flush to the PCB as it should be, with the top of the encoder around 1 millimeter off the PCB, while the back of it is flush against it. I contacted XVX about this, and I'm happy to say I got a quick response with some photos and video. They've assured me that the flaw is an isolated issue with my unit only, and I could see in the photos how it looks with a correctly soldered encoder, and it looks centered in the top case, so should be fine. If you do experience the same flaw as me, I'd suggest you contact XVX or the vendor and have them replace it with a new keyboard, as this definitely isn't a common flaw with all the G75s based on the information that I've received. So with it clear what the issue is there, I just reassembled the keyboard and had a test of the flex compared to the gasket mount. You can see it's stiffened up. There's a decent amount of flex in the middle and the edges are quite a bit firmer, as you'd expect with top mount. Now let's do the top mount typing test. The typing feel is quite a bit stiffer in the top mount configuration as you'd expect. On this particular keyboard I do prefer the top mount, but in general I prefer gasket mounted keyboards, so it really depends on both the keyboard and your preference. In terms of the sound, it was a little bit deeper in the gasket mount configuration I think, a little bit higher in the top mount. And that's the Womier G75. Generally speaking, I like this budget friendly alternative to some of the more expensive transparent keyboards I mentioned earlier. I like the pricing, I like the fact that the switches match the case, I like the screw-in stabilizers, and I like the fact that you have two mounting options to choose from. Of course, I did have a flawed unit, which is a bummer, but as long as this is an isolated flaw with this unit only, then these things happen, and overlooking the flaw for the purposes of the review, I think this is a decent keyboard if you want one of these transparent RGB centric keyboards and you want to spend less than $100. If you like this keyboard, be sure to take a look at some similar keyboards which are on the screen now. Both are excellent keyboards, and I'll catch you in the next one.